Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Kurt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 87 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm Matt. I'm back here today with Jerry. Kurt is still got his full-time job and is having his busy summer. So we're continuing our Big Idea series. This is the second in probably a 10-week series that we're using John Haidt's book, The Happiness Hypothesis, where he looks at big ideas throughout history and religion and philosophy and science, and compares it to modern neuroscience and other modern sciences. So gives us some really good, interesting topics. Even if you're not reading the book with us, hopefully we can give enough background through the episode that we don't lose you as well. So, but as always, we start out with our bright, shiny objects of the week. And I kind of have a light one this week, Jerry, and that is our women's World Cup team. I'm not a big soccer guy. I'm kind of one of those World Cup fans who gets excited about soccer every couple years. I'm so like, for me, I played soccer growing up, but soccer was not big at all in Indiana where I was. And so, I still can't fathom why the U.S. can't even make the men's World Cup. I just don't know how we lose to some small Caribbean island and Belize beats us. I don't know why. I just can't explain it because I don't know soccer. Yeah. But hey, watching our women play is just. It's great, one, to have a team to root for in the World Cup. Two, I love how our women don't flop. One of the things I hate about men's soccer is, like, if you touch somebody, they fall and it looks like they break their leg and then they're up running a marathon the next minute. Our women don't do that. I wish our men would watch our women play because I love how they play. They play hard. They seem to like each other. I sort of like that they got criticized for celebrating too much in the first game, and then they did a golf clap celebration. So they've got the swag that I appreciate as well. So watched them in their game against Sweden in their last kind of round, round robin or whatever they call it. That's my soccer thing. So, Sweden was a really good team, really strong team, but, it's just fun to see a group of people that I'm rooting for come together in such a dominant way. So go USA women. I'm a fan, and I'm cheering for you, and then I won't watch soccer for the next 3 or 4 years, but I'm on board right now. So Jerry, what are you thinking about this week?
I'm thinking that France is going to be tough to beat. So,
yes.
So it's nice, just like in any tournament, every round gets a little tougher.
Yeah.
So we'll see, and they'll bring their best, I'm sure. Kind of looking at that. I'm thinking about how just the summertime changes your experience of the world, getting right. So. Around where we live here in Colorado, traffic is really bad, right? Mm-hmm. But somehow when schools are out and you go, the morning's drive, you get to someplace, you actually get there in a decent amount of time, right? And how that changes your perception of the experience of driving, right? So I had to drive into Denver yesterday, and the roads were clear. And I could, the sun was coming up, and it was just a beautiful experience. I get on the same road, go to the same place, but there's traffic, and it's like a nightmare, right? It's like, so it's not what's actually happening. It's your experience of what's happening that kind of, right? And how do you keep yourself, no matter what's going on in the world, in that kind of space where you could stop and look at the sunrise, right? That's I had that experience yesterday of having the external world support my internal world, and really having an enjoyable drive. And around Denver, that's kind of getting a little bit rare. So
yeah, it is. That is, and I think we both share something too, is that our wives are educators, and I don't know about your house, but I have a very different wife in June or July. The house magically cleans. The dogs get walked. We stay up past 6:30. We're actually going out on a Friday night instead of going to bed like at 7. So like my whole life changes for this 2 months. So I love having my summer Sarah home too. So that puts a smile on my face as well.
That's great. So this is the road to happiness.
Yes, absolutely. So let's, speaking of optimism and pessimism, that's a great, bright, shiny object to introduce this topic. So chapter 2, he labels changing your mind. And really that could mean a couple different things. And his meaning is not necessarily changing how you think maybe about a topic, so to speak, but changing sort of your mindset. And one of the things I took out of this, and one of the big questions I wanted to throw by you, Jerry, is he spends a lot of time in this chapter talking about pessimism and optimism, and presents research that demonstrates that there is a fairly strong genetic component to whether you have an optimistic sort of mindset, or I would like to call it a default, because I think there's a lot of environmental things and other things that go into it, but sort of a default of either an optimistic way to look at the world or a pessimistic way to look at the world. And one of the things that I thought of, and was kind of a question I wanted to throw at you, Jerry, is when he sort of explains this pessimistic mindset, the folks that I've worked with throughout my career who are struggling with trauma, so many of them really would embody what he labels that pessimistic mindset. Now, most of the time, and I think there's always a combination between the nature and the nurture, or our genetics and our experience in our environment. But it made me wonder is how many folks that end up really struggling long-term with PTSD and those sort of things might have a default setting of being more pessimistic. So trauma might have a greater impact on somebody who might already see the world as more negative than positive. And so, it was a question more than an insight, because I didn't necessarily have a way to kind of connect that to any other research. But I really wanted to get your thoughts on, as people that you work with that might end up in higher levels of services, do you think that this default that he's talking about in the research might play a role in that to some extent?
Well, I think he has a negative bias.
Which he does own.
I know that. I know that. So that's where I start. Is he? First of all, he's a very good attorney, right?
Yeah.
Creates a case, and then he gets a lot of research to support a particular view he has to it. So I think it's very important for our listeners to understand that there's multiple kinds of views on these issues, and that this issue that you talk about whether genes are a blueprint or whether they're really driving some of this is still debatable, right? And people fall on different camps about this. My experience is that's a good research question. It's not necessarily a good clinical question. Because we deal with what comes into our office, and then we have to figure out how to help the individual in some way shift some of that to be able to look at the world in a different way. So, my thought about this is that there's always some genetic vulnerability to everything in life, right? And whether that genetics has to do with actually you have more genes for this, or whether we know that epigenetic experiences get passed from one generation to the another. It's really hard to kind of say what is nature and what is nurture. What we know is there's a combination of that. But we also know that early life experiences have the ability to change how genes are expressed. And that individuals who live in a world in which their needs are responded to in a consistent, predictable way, in which a caregiver is attentive and sensitive and responsive, also lays the groundwork for people to have a more positive view of themselves and others in the world and their capabilities to impact that world, right? And so we have these potential genetic loading, we have this early life experiences, and then we have later on future experiences, right? And so when you have somebody that may have a genetic vulnerability, you have somebody who has life experiences early in life, and then they run into something difficult, it's going to have a bigger impact on them, right? So there is literature that really talks about, the research out of New Zealand in which they looked at people have serotonin alleles that basically there's a long and a short, and right, people who have two longs tend to be more resistant to traumatic experiences early in life. They're kind of looking at that. People who have two shorts are more vulnerable to that piece because in terms of the amount of serotonin that's getting created. However, when those people who have these two shorts are in a loving, caring, responsive environment, it actually doesn't become a risk factor. Mm-hmm. So you can have a genetic predisposition, and then you have an experience in your early relationship that really becomes a protective factor. So I think that the takeaway from this is when you have someone come in your office, how do you in some ways begin to understand what led this person to be in the world in this particular way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? And then in some ways, how do I help this person, one, understand how they're in the world in a particular way, and maybe in their experience, this has been adaptive. Mm-hmm. And how might we, in our interactions, whether it's looking at cognitions, their body to do it, begin to help you change that?
Yeah.
How to look at things differently.
Yeah. Well, and I think you really hit it right on the head. Is that I always, and I like this book enough that I wanted to spend 10 weeks with you talking about it. But this was there's, and I would love to get your opinion on this as well, is I really struggle with researchers, and I have a lot of respect for this man before I even read this book. But I really struggle when you fall back on twin studies, because twin studies to me is the lazy way to talk about genetics. Because twin studies I think we're fascinated with because it's like, and there was a great CNN actually did a great documentary on triplets who were really unethically in an experiment that nobody knew about that was involved, where they were separating people at birth and then studying them without any acknowledgement to the adopted parents or the people in this study. It's a fascinating documentary on CNN and kind of talks about some of the dark aspects of psychological research. But immediately, like, what makes the press is, oh, how similar these three guys were. And, Haidt does the same thing with another set of twins. But then when you get to know them a little bit more, you do see the variation. And so, probably the biggest struggle I had with his thing throughout the book is, when you have to fall back on twin studies for genetics, you're kind of being lazy, in my opinion, as a researcher. Yeah, there's a lot we can learn from twins, but most of the time they're adopted in a similar geographic location. And you start to look at the differences is there's always things. I mean, I think you could look at your life and my life and you can say, wow, we're similar in so many ways. And then you get a little deeper and you see the differences pop up. So, I really agree with you. And I think his point is an interesting one about that predisposition. But, again, to me, whether we're talking about addiction or mindsets or anything with psychology or vulnerability, I find, especially with epigenetics and how some of our genes are those non-coded DNA, which is 95+% of our overall DNA, expresses itself differently throughout the lifespan. And so I kind of fall in the same area as you do is, one, I don't see necessarily too much of the value in looking at this. But B, I think it's to pull apart what is nature and what is nurture is almost impossible. It's funny, the better the science gets, I think we have to say it's nature and nurture with that regard. And I just kind of wondered, with all your research, sort of, what do you think about some of the twin studies and how researchers like him really use it to exemplify the genetic or nature side of the argument?
I have known a number of twins, and there's something very unique about twins, right? So there is a factor to that. So I don't really want to, in some ways, discredit all that literature that looks like that, right? But like every other literature, when you're looking for something, you find it, right? And I think that human beings are way more complex, and sometimes when research tries to break down and look at a component of something without looking at it in a larger, that it becomes useful information, but not sufficient to explain what we're seeing in front of us. So in a way, I don't discredit it. I just don't know that it tells the whole story of that, right? Because you can have some really, some twins who are very, very, very different, right? And some who are incredibly connected in some ways. And how do we make sense of those things? The other piece is, I also think at some level, because we're a very cognitive, verbal species, we downplay some of our instinctual behavioral things, right? As one of my nieces just had a baby yesterday. And you watch some of the changes in my niece as she prepared to be a mom and to do it, is how much of that is driven by hundreds of thousands of years of preparing to doing that, right? And yes, she went to classes and knows all this stuff, but there's a piece of us that I listened to some Stephen Sumi's research on rhesus monkeys, who does some incredible work. He worked with Harry Harlow, and he was at the National Institute of Mental Health. But there's a lot of the behaviors that rhesus monkeys do, especially adolescent rhesus monkeys, that I could identify with. Right? Yeah. And I think how much of what we do as adolescents in forming little groups of males and then leaving and then joining the the female's kind of family and kind of has a lot to do with our biological history.
Yeah.
Right? To kind of look. So when we're kind of looking at this, I think we can err on putting too much value on genetics and doing it. And I think we can err on downplaying some of this stuff.
Yeah.
They're kind of looking at that. So I think it's just a nice, great philosophical discussion. They're kind of looking at that.
Yeah, and I think, back when I was in school, the nature versus nurture argument was so in the forefront as even though the attachment literature had been out for a while, you really had this. And I wonder, when will, I think, in psychology, when will we stop that and sort of move on from that argument, I think is an interesting thing. So, Jerry, the next thing on this that I thought was interesting in this chapter, and it's been a while since I've seen Beck's cognitive triad of depression. I saw this and I used the Beck depression inventory many times as a therapist. But I really thought, and I guess this wasn't a surprise, but I just thought it was he kind of helped me connect these two things. Is how Beck sort of looks at depression is sort of threefold. One is the negative view of the self, so a negative self view, oftentimes beating up, always taking like maybe over responsibility for anything wrong that's happened, but a very negative kind of view of self, very little hope and a negative view for the future, and then a negative view of the world. And one of the things, again, not necessarily a surprise, but one of the things that I saw this fit almost perfectly over, but maybe the difference is more impactful than the similarities with what Judith Herman and others talk about with the personal narrative and the trauma's impact on the personal narrative, where when I teach about the story of ourselves and trauma, I talk about a negative view of self, negative view of the world. I'd say a negative view of a future is part of that. But the thing that differentiates how I teach personal narrative and trauma versus Beck's triad is I also include in there a negative view of relationships, because so often trauma is inflicted in the context of relationships that we have with other people. And obviously one of the big symptoms of trauma is depression. And I'm sure it's probably not the first time you put those two together, but just kind of wonder if any insight there is. I love it when pieces of research do come together and fit in a really good way. But when you compare the personal narrative work of trauma and what Beck's, really brilliant insights about cognitive behavioral therapy and depression, just sort of any thinking you might have on those two things when we bring those together under the trauma-informed lens.
When I read that, it made me think of Alexander McFarland's work that kind of looked at, one would think, right, is that when we think about diagnostic categories, right, is that PTSD would be the highest outcome of being exposed to a traumatic potential event, right? But really, the highest diagnostic category is depression.
Yeah.
Right? Is that the number of people who have gone through these adverse experiences who have depression is significantly higher. Mm-hmm. But then when you look at the population of people who have depression, who have kind of do it, they meet the criteria for re-experiencing, right? Is that in their head, these people who have depression continue to go back and ruminate or think and revisit things that kind of happened in the past and kind of looking at that, right? And so when we kind of differentiate these categories, and say, oh, I'm a traumatologist and I do trauma work and you do this depression work to do it, is lots of people who do trauma work have to be able to deal with depression, right? Have to be able to kind of manage that, the sense of helplessness and hopelessness, this sense of kind of seeing. And matter of fact, in the DSM-5, one of the categories is this mood issue, right? This negative mood issue. So, you know, I think it's very important when we kind of begin to pull apart is that this ability to regulate negative affect states, this ability to maintain positive affect states, cuts across a lot of diagnostic categories, right? And that's a really important understanding when we're looking at that. Our clients, they may have anxiety, but look more like a depressive client than another anxiety client.
Right.
So that's that piece. And so this issue of depression and PTSD is an important component. However, I have not necessarily found it an effective way to start with cognitions as a way of changing that. I think that, to me, in my experience with working with people who have trauma, one is I've got to create a different relational experience. Two is I've got to help them develop capacities to tolerate these changing affect states internally, right? And then we can move up and eventually get to working on a narrative.
Yeah.
Right? And so when I move to narrative too quickly with trauma people, one is it's scary, right? It's to let go of this. It's kind of do it. And two is their narrative in some ways helps them have, that's how their writer made sense of what's happening in their bodies.
Yeah.
Right? So if I don't in some ways work with sensations, emotions, and making it safe in the interpersonal relationship, I'm not very successful at changing some of those narratives, right? And even when you look at trauma-focused cognitive behavioral approaches that are very good with dealing with more single episode traumatic event, the changing of the narrative is the last phase of that process, right? And then kind of looking at it. So even in there, they've learned that there has to be some psychoeducation. There has to be some development of coping skills and kind of change it. There has to be some cognitive understanding of this process, but not necessarily going to changing that process yet, right? So I give them a framework to understand it and to do. So this is again another indication to me of an individual, one who had a positive experience with this himself. And two is he did the research, and the most highly researched is this, and so he comes back. But really, when we're reading through this, there's things to glean from this that are really positive and take away. But there's also this issue of, I have not had this experience working with really trauma people to just kind of challenge their cognitive distortions.
Right. And I wonder too is what he's not speaking of. And again, he's covering a lot of big things at kind of a higher level. So I'll give him a lot of leeway on this, but you know, any good cognitive behavioral therapist, because that's mostly the modality that I was trained in, and now being a motivational interview trainer, which is a cognitive behavioral approach. Any good cognitive behavioral therapist knows about the importance of the relationship. And I think he sort of gleamed over that in this chapter. Maybe just because, if you're going to write everything, this could be a book in of itself. But I think you're absolutely right. I think some of that might just be inherent to the cognitive behavioral approach, which he doesn't really mention in this chapter. But I think this is where I love putting that trauma lens on it is, Beck came to so many of the conclusions that we see in the trauma research, and really resetting that narrative. And a good cognitive behavioral therapist is creating that healthy, safe relationship before they're talking about the change aspects. They may be giving you some homework, but usually it's pretty light to begin with. It's not the, hey, let's rethink your view of the world, but just, the journaling and those sort of things. So yeah, I think this was a fascinating thing to put our trauma lens on, because I'd say, there in a Venn diagram, so much of this overlaps, but even what trauma can add to that, I think is a really important piece. Is you're not going to jump right necessarily to the cognitive restructuring. The relationship might take, for folks with trauma, it may take months to build in a therapeutic relationship, especially for people with that complex or compound trauma as well.
And I would even challenge the belief that motivational interviewing is a cognitive behavioral intervention. I bet you if you were to break it down to micro frames of what's happening between the person who's really holding the ambivalence, who's sharing a joint complementary goal, who's basically having a reflective, affective experience with it. There's so much relationally going on in a good motivational interaction, is that I would bet that we can kind of create a different understanding of why this learned process of motivational interviewing has such good impacts on individuals who feel seen, heard, and valued, which go back to those underlying principles of motivation and
I've got 3 podcasts to say about that, but I think
I know that's I think it's a very powerful intervention to kind of be thinking about that.
Well, and I think I think where we're at, sort of almost as psychology, is we had this, again in the late 90s when I was coming up, is cognitive behavioral therapy was sort of a reaction to, and this is where I can talk about Kurt since he's not on the podcast, is it was sort of a reaction to the hardcore behavioralism. Yeah. And we needed something more than what we were doing to mice and things like that. So it brought the thinking and feeling into the equation. So it gave us more of that. But now what I love to see, especially with the trauma, is we're kind of pulling some of the best, and this is what I think the MI does, pull some of the best aspects from that. And then we can now say, with all this research on the relational context, is how do we create trust and safety as the foundation for really anything we do, whether it's trauma, personal narrative work, whether it's EMDR and that kind of reprocessing, or whether it's having somebody sit with their ambivalence. And, so I love how we're bringing this research into these innovative models in really cool ways. So it's sort of fun now that I've been in the field for 25 plus years to sort of see the evolution of this moving forward.
Yeah, and I think we also have, with technology, the capacity to look at the convergence of these findings across fields, right? Mm-hmm. Across fields, to kind of help us kind of have a better understanding. When you're kind of looking at cognitions and you're measuring cognitions, you're going to say cognitions are right. If I'm a neuroscientist and my primary area is to look at the amygdala, the amygdala is doing all this, right? But the amygdala doesn't do anything separate from all the other things so really when we break these things apart, we have a piece of the puzzle, but really, again, we begin to say is how do we begin to integrate this knowledge and information so that we can kind of individualize our approach to the person that's sitting in front of us.
Yep, absolutely.
What's the experience they need to kind of, so for some, really is a cognitive approach that feels safe and kind of able. And for another one, it's kind of let's do some body work to do it.
Yeah.
Right? So if I have more lenses in my repertoire to kind of see my client, then it allows me to kind of make sense through multiple kinds of perspectives to kind of, and then approach them, as opposed to, you know, I'm a trauma guy, so you know, if you're getting angry, I'm understanding you're re-experiencing your trauma. It's like, no, right? So really, we get trained to see, we see what we're trained to see.
Yeah, exactly.
So if we could get training in multiple ways, we could see it in multiple perspectives.
Yeah. Well, and that's the only good thing I can say is I was trained in the era of eclectic therapy, where I became an expert on nothing, but I knew a little bit about a lot. So I had no idea what to do once I sat across from a client. But man, I could Gestalt, I could Freud, I could Jung. I had a little bit of knowledge on all these. And at least the good thing I took out of that is I could see the individual in front of me from a lot of different perspectives. Now, when the trauma lens came in, it gave me a much deeper understanding, especially with populations that I've worked with as well. The other thing, and I think this may be its own podcast sometimes, because I nerd out about this next topic, is priming. And priming, there's some fascinating research done on this, is that if you set the brain up in a way through positive, negative, or you get the brain even subconsciously by flashing something on a screen for a second where your prefrontal cortex isn't necessarily registering it in your consciousness, it changes your next behavior. And I think priming is a fascinating tool for us. One of the things, and I wrote about this in Connecting Paradigms, that I really found, I love this because I grew up, Jerry, I know you remember this, the Pepsi challenge back in the 80s. And at the time, Coke had about 1/3 of the market share. Coke had 2/3 of the market share. Pepsi had 1/3. And Pepsi did this blind taste test called the Pepsi Challenge. And if you turned on the TV at the time, every other commercial was the Pepsi Challenge, where what they found during these blind taste tests was 2/3 of people actually preferred Pepsi over Coke. And this was such a powerful finding. I try to think about a research study that had more of a financial impact, that Coke dropped its original the original Coca-Cola product actually had cocaine in it. So at least its product in the 80s dropped it and introduced new Coke for about 15 minutes until everybody hated it, and then brought back Coca-Cola, and they called it classic at the time. So if you didn't know, people really, you could say, preferred Pepsi over Coke at a 2-to-3 ratio. Once we got functional MRIs, they did this great experiment where they had people in an MRI machine and they did the blind taste test. And what they found, when people didn't know what they were getting, they processed the experience of taking an unknown beverage. They processed that in the taste centers of their brain. But when they were told Coke, and they preferred Coke, at least they thought they preferred Coke, they actually processed the experience of drinking it in the pleasure centers of the brain. So we saw even the experience of something very simple that we would think is very, very objective, is taste. Our experience when we get told something, it really changed how we processed what came next. And, you know, these studies are very interesting about how something negative or positive really influences our experience of what next. Another great study in this is they did a study with Asian women in taking math tests. And all this is played on stereotypes, so I want to throw that out there. But they had Asian women think about being Asian, which the stereotype of Asians is that they're really good at math. So they had one group think about being Asian before taking a math test. the other group thought about being a woman, which, again, stereotypes, this is my study, stereotypes of women is they do worse on math. Again, this is not my research. And when these Asian women thought about being Asian, they performed much higher on the math test than when they thought about being a woman. And so, one of the things that I thought of in my book is how can we give, before we have these difficult discussions about change talk or other things, how can we have give people an opportunity to think about their strengths or think about their past accomplishments in order to sort of build confidence up in order to take on bigger issues? Because sometimes I think we jump right into the big challenge in front of folks, which oftentimes, depending on what happened before they walk into our meeting with them, can just overwhelm them. And so psychology, I think, has done a little bit. I think MI does a little bit of bringing this in, but I think we could do a lot more with this of having people think about positive things before we tackle some of these big changes. And Jerry, I kind of wonder, in your experience, is the concept of priming kind of entered your consciousness and thinking about your work, either as with programming or also as a therapist?
Well, my first association is I wish somebody told me to imagine myself as an Asian woman when I was taking I was terrible at it. I didn't realize that was a coping skill that could work. So that was my first association. Is
just to clarify, Jerry, if you're not an Asian woman, I'm not sure
all right.
How much that would would be an interesting study.
Right. So I'm an example of I'm a male and I can't do math. So it's like, all right. So that was my first association. Now let me get on to my next association. Right. My next association was how scary that is for us in watching television and watching is how kind of vulnerable we are to these influences, or going into a supermarket or going into a store that, telling me I need something, right? That's my second association. My third association is, for me, this concept of mindfulness, right? Of not being stimulus bound, is how do I stop and be able to kind of recognize my internal experience before I respond to the world. Yeah. And that's a developmental. But my last association in that had to do with as I do EMDR with individuals, building in resources for them. Yeah. So part of the stages before you get to kind of working on the traumatic experiences and reprocessing that is that you go through a resourcing process, right? And you kind of create a calm place for your clients, and you have them do it, and then you process that in, or you have them bring in allies of a nurturer, or you bring in allies of a wise person or a strong person, or so you're actually building in internal resources that they can then access when dealing with this traumatic event, right? In a way, what we're doing is priming the brain to be able to have these anchors when I confront this kind of stress. What do they need? They could bring in these resources to help them in some ways scaffold the self as they deal with that and have a different experience of that. Yeah. Or imagine it being on a video instead of kind of doing it. So we're using the brain's capacity to create these different states, right? And then we're, for those who watched last week, I couldn't remember pendulation, right? From being. But then what we're doing is we're going towards something that's stressful, and we're going back to something that's more calming or rewarding or positive or strength-based. And then we're revisiting, right? And that by being attentive and attuned, what I'm trying to help this individual do is have one foot in the past and one foot in the present, right? And so that's an example of where we can use this capacity of the brain to create these internal strengths to help us to kind of confront it. But like all good things, it could also be used against us.
Yeah.
And the more we could stop and be attentive and attuned to what's happening inside of us before we respond, the less stimulus bound we become.
Yeah.
So that moves on to this next issue that he read in the book about mindfulness.
Yeah.
But the challenge for that, for somebody who has a trauma history, is significant.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And the scary thing is that, and advertisers who have a lot more money than we do have found ways to talk to our elephant, the emotional part of our brain, and circumvent our rider, which even if we're mindfulness can help us then think about, okay, I'm having this reaction, what do I do with it? I love another study is if they flash a picture of a soft drink before a movie in a quick way where you can't even register it consciously, you're more likely to get up and go get a soft drink before the movie starts. So we've got to be really careful about this. But one other way I just want to add to that, because I want to get to the final piece on mindfulness.
For me, it makes me think I got to go to the bathroom again.
Which, if you're there, you might get some popcorn anyway. So, but this is where I think values exercises and strength-based exercises can really, again, get people grounded in their strengths of the present to look at the harder things they have to deal with. The other thing I just want to point out there too is I always in my trainings, I talk about the importance of the front desk folks and the people when they walk into your office, your clinic, your school, what do they feel? Because if they have a great experience in the waiting room, their elephant is regulated and their rider is ready to go with me where we need to go. So I always just think about some of the priming we do is their experience before their medical visit or before their therapy appointment. So I just always like to throw that out there because whenever we can really demonstrate the importance of front desk folks in that environment, I think it's key as well.
As you were talking, one of the things to be thinking about is I worked with a young lady who's probably in her 30s, but she was significantly sexually abused as a child, right? And in this frightened, scary space and her developmental age, she was continually told that she liked this, right? So you think about what we're talking about and how the messages that the perpetrator is sending to the victim during this state and how that gets kind of encoded in the experience, and how powerful that is later on in the writer making sense of that experience. Right? And so I think it's very important not to just think, oh, this is a pessimistic person who's kind of taking responsibility and kind of is lots of what our clients have learned about how to make sense of what's going on inside of them has a lot to do with the messages they receive in this highly vulnerable space. Right? And so there's a part of them that in some ways identifies with the messages they receive. That's how they put meaning to their experience. So in this cognitive way, how do I help them relook at that and create new meaning for that experience? Right? To kind of manage that. So this vulnerability to being influenced by the external messages we receive, think about as a child who is vulnerable and is dependent, receiving either positive messages about the self or really devaluing or even violent messages about the self.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that's where, that cognitive restructuring can play. But we're also, what I don't think, I learned when I'm in my training of cognitive behavioral therapy necessarily is with trauma, we're working through so much shame as well with it. Because again, when I'm facing this, a lot of times it can be very shameful experience as well. And that can just get us stuck too. So the last thing in the few minutes we have left, and I think we've kind of set this up, but I think it was an interesting conclusion that he came to. And I think one that I think we can put the trauma-informed lens on really easy. But so when he talks about shifting mindsets, and again, he's not talking specifically about trauma here, but we can easily bring this in again, is that he offers sort of 3 treatments. And a lot of times he can see each of these are good. Some are going to be better for some people and less effective for others. Sometimes all 3 of them might be really good. But he says, when he looks at the research, he sees incredibly high effectiveness in cognitive behavioral therapy. And this is more for depression, but Prozac and those sort of family of drugs, antidepressive drugs. And he also throws mindfulness in there as well. And I really appreciated that mindfulness and his thinking rose to the same research-based effectiveness or efficacy as the other 2. Because I don't, we often talk traditionally about medication for depression, CBT for depression. But again, mindfulness, I love it how it made right at that same level. And I think if we put the trauma-informed lens on this a little bit, medication is something that we know can be helpful for some folks for sure. And I love, and I think the trauma movement has been somewhat responsible, though I think it's coming from different angles, how a lot of CBT now, including EMDR, if you want to throw that under the CBT umbrella, but other are in really bringing this mindfulness aspect into it. So I think at least the cognitive behavioral piece and the mindfulness are kind of merging together in some ways in a lot of interventions. But I just kind of wanted to get your feelings, Jerry, on his sort of triangle of mindfulness, CBT, and meds, especially for maybe addressing the pessimism and helping be more optimistic about the world or treating depression.
I think those are good components. There's tons of research on exercise.
Yeah.
There's tons of research coming out on yoga. Mm-hmm. There's tons of research coming out on animal assisted.
Yeah.
Again, is when you look at the research and you pick out these 3 things, they're really important to hold in your toolkit and to kind of look at that. And there's a number of other strategies in doing it. And also is, what's the developmental age of the person that you're dealing with?
Yeah.
Right? Is that talk therapy has not been very effective for lots of our clients. Yeah. So what we know is art and music and more kinds of body work where you're kind of looking at it. And so when we're looking at these pieces, again, this is good research and it should go into you, but it doesn't tell the whole story.
Yeah.
That you really want to be able, as an individual, to say is, how can I continue to get resources so that I could better serve the people that I have
right.
in it, as opposed to, this is what I do, and you come in and I provide this for you, and if you don't get better, it must be because you're resistant, is that really there's a number. And this goes back to research in general. Mm-hmm. Research in general is wanting to control something that feels out of control. We're traumatized by this, and so let's figure out, right? And so for us to be, in a way, these are really good. This is a gentleman that's really good at having a model and doing some research and putting some facts and kind of to do it together, and it makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah.
Is read somebody like this, and then read somebody who has and there's other literature. And as we begin to kind of expand some of that stuff, we now have to make sense, like you said, is he even says it, when you really read the literature, lots of this stuff works, right? Yeah. The question is, in what dose, right? How much of this works? In what timing? In what frequency? And what intensity?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that how do I begin to kind of individualize, whether it's relationship or whether it's cognition, whether is how many times a week, right? This model of going to therapy for 45 minutes a week to be able to do it really doesn't, there's no scientific research that said that's the right dose.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, so again, there's a lot for us to learn about how do we take these techniques and what's the best way to apply them so that they get the best outcomes for them.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you one final question. And I know, and it's kind of a big one. And we're running out of time, but I can't leave his triad without something I've sort of struggled with is, and he says this, if any of our psychiatrist friends are watching this, these are his words, but I think some of us have this experience with some psychiatrists as well, is psychiatrists often see some of them, and again, this is his words, is their tool is their prescription pad. And that, by the way, I think groups all psychiatrists in an unfair way. But one of the tools that they have, and I think modern medicine sets them up to do this, is they're more in that medical model where let's diagnose and treat. And for a lot of them, their treatment is medication. So when you're sitting with somebody, Jerry, that's not on medication and struggling with trauma, and if you make that referral to a psychiatrist, there's probably a good chance that they're going to come out of that meeting with a prescription. How do you sort of assess that third piece of medication? In some ways, I'm not anti-medication. I've seen medication change people's lives. I would make the argument, especially working with kids in special education and child welfare and juvenile justice, that a lot of those kids, I would say, are over-medicated. And I'm trying to work through and find the real kid under all the medication and sometimes the haze that the side effects do. So I kind of wonder, in your thinking, if you're sitting across from somebody, maybe the first 3 or 4 sessions, and how does medication and the benefits and cost of medication kind of play into your thinking of whether or not you might make that referral to a psychiatrist for that individual?
Well, one is, I think, what is the age of the person that is in front of me, right? Is many of the medications we use were really not appropriate for kids whose brains are developing and kind of sensitive to kind of looking at these, right? And so you have to be a lot more cautious. Doesn't mean that medications can't be used, but we have to really be thinking, are there other strategies, approaches in doing it, right? So that's one thing, is what's the age of this child or this young adolescent or this adult? The second piece is, I work with my client, they're the ones in their body knowing, can they tolerate this? Yeah. Is that we could do this work, and we can kind of maybe get you to a different space, but in that process, there's a level of distress that what you can handle or can't. Yeah. And so I lay out for them the possibility that while we're doing this work, you can get some medication to help you to titrate the distress that's going on, right? Or to get some sleep, or to get some. And really, what I really feel is it's my job to help them make that, help them to understand, inform them to do it, and then help them weigh out that decision, right? To kind of looking at that piece. And oftentimes I will say to a client, why don't you go and have this discussion with the psychiatrist about what the possibilities are, because they're the experts in this medication. And then come back to me and let's process what you're feeling and thinking and doing it. And so that we can begin to look at what that means. Because in a way, there's always this fear, am I crazy, right? Am I crazy if I'm doing it, right? Kind of looking at that. There's always a fear of, if you take this away, who am I?
Yeah.
Right? There's all sorts of anxiety that goes along with that. So the medication, right, is a scaffolding that, just like everything else, they perceive through their experience of working with people. If I have a lack of trust, or I feel like being dependent on something is really frightening and scary, or kind of doing it, we've got to work through those issues in our relationship. And through what that means for them. So yes, you could just send somebody to get medication and they feel better. But my experience with trauma is that the medication becomes part of the treatment process. Right? And them being able to do it. So it's not an easy, everybody who comes in who's in pain, I just send you to get a psychiatric evaluation, and you get it and you come back and, I feel better. Everything they see is seen through this experience. They have a trauma lens that's much more, in some ways, sophisticated than my trauma lens. I learn from their trauma lens.
Yeah. Wonderfully put. I think it's something a lot of folks, especially maybe those even more so not in the therapeutic role, really struggle, because a lot of folks who might not be ready for mental health services or not willing to go to mental health services are engaged in psychiatry. But I think I love that idea of sending them, having them get the information, and then bringing that back to process. I think if we have that capacity, and maybe even be, having that open communication. I know psychiatry is such a scarcity in so many communities that it's like, boy, if you can get in for some of our folks, especially on Medicaid, you're lucky to get in within a month, and maybe you get the prescription, but then you process that even with somebody, hopefully a mental health folk, that can help you through the positive and benefits of that. But I think I love that approach of helping them go get the information and processing that with them. I think that's a much better model than kind of our send them, get them in whenever you can, and then they're on the medication and there's not a whole lot of real follow-up there in a way that's meaningful.
It's the same way when they want to get off medication, right? It's like, let's process through this. Let's really understand what's going on, and go to the doctor and talk to them. So, that's where this issue of motivational interviewing, right? As you could do 3 other episodes on that, but that's where, in some ways, how do I help this person change? There's some issues of, this medication's helping me be different, and there's a part of me that I'm not ready yet to be different, whatever that may be. So I think that, medication is out there. It's a support. I get a headache, I take aspirin. You do it. Sometimes, drink water. Can my headache go away? Because I'm just getting dehydrated, right? But again, it doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It just means how can I make good decisions about those things that are in my life?
Wonderful. Great episode, Jerry. This has been fun. It's amazing how we could probably make 3 episodes out of each of these chapters. So hopefully, if we haven't sold you on the book yet, these discussions and the ideas that they're spurring, hopefully it's a good read. So we'll come back and we'll look at the 3rd chapter in the book next week. And as always, you can find show notes, discussion questions at traumainformedlens.org. And thank you, everybody. When this comes out, we'll know if our U.S. women's team have won their first round of the World Cup. So go, ladies. And we'll see you all next week for another discussion. Thank you.
Adios.